Please welcome National Higher Education reporter of the Washington Post, Danielle Douglas-Gabriel.
Thanks so much, Katie. Thank you all for joining us today for what we hope will be a really dynamic conversation about the future of higher education and the future of the cost and delivery of higher education. The $1.7 trillion in outstanding student debt in this country has spawned debates about the role colleges and universities should play in mitigating what many see as a debt crisis. The cost of higher education is formidable and downright prohibitive for many families. And without innovation to shake up the cost structure and delivery of higher education, the sustainability and future of the sector may be at risk. Our panel will hopefully dive into some of these heady issues and give you some thought-provoking concepts and models for which perhaps the sector could rely upon as we move forward into the next generation of higher ed. We're going to kick off today's panel with Ara Austin, Senior Director of Online Engagement and Strategic Initiatives in the Office of the Dean at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who's also Clinical Assistant Professor of School of Molecular Sciences at Arizona State University. Ara, over to you.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you everyone for joining the panel session today. As Danielle mentioned, my name is Ara Austin, and I am a faculty as well as an administrator at Arizona State University. So I think that for the most of you who are joining, this is a very pertinent discussion that we should have. For those of you who are joining who are students, I know that the debt crisis that you're faced with, higher cost of living, so on and so forth, the question of does getting this degree, is that going to lead you to getting a career that you want, right? So those are all the questions that you have, and that is so fair, and that is something that's, I think, very worth discussing in today's panel. And for those faculty and the staff members that represent the various different universities that are joining, you know that something has to change. And you're here in this session because you do care about our students and our student success. And so, it is probably worrisome to you as you look at all the things that are playing out. What are we going to do on the students' behalf? And as Danielle said, the amount of debt that we are faced with in the context of higher education alone, it is worrisome to all of us. And I think that is why we are here this morning to discuss some of the relevant things that are happening in higher education and how we can work together to provide a disruptive change in order to make sure that our students are set for better and in a better pathway, and also in terms of what they would like to achieve for the greater good for themselves, for their families, and for the society. And so where we are at right now is often, and this is fair. So students' concerns are generally directly to the universities because they are paying the universities in terms of tuition dollars. But in order for us to make this creative change or a worthwhile change, it is not just on the universities alone. And I think that that's also worth pointing out. It has to be a collective effort across the academic institutions, also in the private sectors that are going to employ our students, and also in terms of the government at the state level and the federal level. And in terms of how we're going to move forward, we should definitely discuss today what some are the modalities that we could, utilize. And we learned a lot from COVID in terms of online learning. How do we make sure that our students are getting the modality that's going to best fit their lifestyle and the current challenges that they're faced with in terms of the decisions that they have to make? And so I hope that we will have a very enthusiastic discussion across these topics. And I'm going to hand it over to Danielle so that we can then have some more questions that are going to direct our conversation.
Thank you so much, Ara. Joining us now is Bryan Caplan, Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Bryan?
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to start by giving a very contrarian view of everything we're talking about. I've written a book called The Case Against Education. And the heart of the book is to say that the main reason why people want education is not really to learn useful skills. The main reason why people want education is to get a stamp on their forehead, to get certification. This is important, not for the individual student. It doesn't really matter that much why you're in school. It does work. It does get you a better job. It does get you more money. But from the point of view of education policy, it really does matter. Because if I'm right, then the main effect of encouraging education, of increasing access, is not to actually make a more skilled workforce. It is not really to expand the availability of high skilled jobs. The main thing that we get is credential inflation. Right? Since we're in the middle of inflation, it's easier to understand what credential inflation is. Credential inflation is when you need more degrees to get the same job that your parents or grandparents were able to get with less. There's a lot of evidence that we've had severe credential inflation since 1945 at least. You need over 3 more years of education to get one and the same job. Of course, the economy has changed too, but even jobs that have been very stagnant, we can see that you need more education in order to get those jobs. All right. The upshot of all this is that I do not think that we should be trying to encourage more education. I think we already have way too much. If you think about the point of student loan programs, what is their goal? Their goal is to increase access, to make education more affordable, to increase the number of people going. If those are good goals, then these are good programs, and it makes sense to be trying to figure out ways to improve them and to expand them. If I'm right, the opposite is true. If I'm right, these are bad programs because they are trying to increase the amount of education that people get, and it's already excessive. It is already counterproductive. It is already a dysfunctional system. So my view is that if we are going to have the system that we have, at minimum, we should say that people have to actually repay their debts. Otherwise, it is tantamount to saying that we have free college for all. I know a lot of people like the idea of free college for all. And if it was a great thing just to get as many people to go to school as possible, free college for all is exactly what would make sense to do. On the other hand, if I'm right and most of what you learn in school is not useful in real life, if the main effect of having degree proliferation is that you just need more degrees to get the same job you're going to get otherwise, then it is not a good idea to try to make college free for all. Instead, we should really be looking for ways to discourage people from going if they aren't getting some very clear benefits from it. So that is really where I am coming from here. Again, I understand that if my starting point seems crazy to you, then everything else that I'm saying seems crazy to you. But is my starting point really so crazy? If you actually think about what it is that you learn in school, how much really is useful in the real world, I have to say it's just not very much. Most of what happens is people learn, cram before the final exam, and then they take the test and then they forget about it. And why? Because they know they're never going to need to know it again. The slogan that I like to put forward is that we like to think about education as job training, whereas actually it is more like a passport to the real training that happens on the job. I say that a functional system is one where we try to move people as quickly as possible to that last stage, not have people killing a lot of time studying material that is not really relevant to what they're doing. It'd be much better to have a world where people just went straight from high school to whatever job they're going to get, if that's possible. And honestly, for most jobs, that is totally possible, because what you're learning in college is not going to be something you actually need to know later on. I'm happy to go and take questions about this, but this is really where I'm coming from. I think it is a mistake to be trying to expand access. Access is already greatly excessive. And finally, last point is there is so much focus on what is best for students. It's important to remember someone is paying for this stuff. Those people are ultimately taxpayers. And this really is a case where you should be thinking about, it might be a benefit to me as a student now, but in the long run, I'm going to be someone that's paying for it. So we should focus on what is actually a good idea rather than what sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. So rounding out today's panel is Michael D. Smith, J. Eric Johnson Professor of Information and Technology and Marketing at Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy. Michael, over to you.
Danielle, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm going to take a different tack than Bryan, as much as I respect his book and his positions. And I'm going to argue that one of the big problems with higher education today is that our mission is noble, our mission is good, and I worry that our model is getting in the way of us fulfilling our mission. The way I get there is I do a lot of research on how technology changes things. And what we see in the world is that successful firms, successful institutions get successful by creating the right processes, the right incentives, the right structure that is suited very well for their current environment. The problem comes when technology comes in and changes that environment. And a lot of firms find that their old way of doing business is really hard to translate into this new world. And if you tell this story really well in class, you end up telling a very depressing story. You talk about how, Kodak died, Blockbuster died, BlackBerry died, Britannica died. And if you tell it really well, some student in the back row is going to raise their hand and say, Professor Smith, can you tell me any positive examples of industries that have responded well to technological change? And at that point, what I typically say is, yes, I can. In fact, my colleague Rahul Talang and I have spent the last 15 years studying the entertainment industry. And I think the entertainment industry is a fabulous example of an industry that got massively disrupted by technology and yet changed and is doing quite well. And we'll talk about it next class. And what we do in the next class is we try to unpack why was the entertainment industry able to make these changes in a world where so many other industries weren't. And to me, the key thing is that the entertainment industry initially correctly saw technology as a threat to their way of doing business, as a threat to their model. But at some point, they realized their way of doing business wasn't their model, that my model isn't my mission, that my mission isn't selling shiny plastic discs for 20 bucks a pop. My mission is creating great entertainment and getting that entertainment in front of an audience. And if I can use technology to fulfill my mission, I want to do that even if it means blowing up my business model. Now, what does all this have to do with education? Well, I think what this has to do with education is at the beginning of the pandemic, I started to see people in higher education saying a lot of the same things I had heard the entertainment industry say in the early 2010s. We were saying things like technology, is not something we want to incorporate into the way we deliver education. And by the way, technology will not change our power in the industry. That, elite higher education has always been powerful and technology can't change that. My mission, if you will, is to try to make an argument that higher education needs to come back and rediscover our mission. Our mission is not charging a bunch of wealthy kids $250,000 to get the certification that Bryan's talking about. Our mission is to create great opportunities for students from all walks of life to discover their talents, develop those talents, and use their talents for the benefit of society. And my argument is I think our model of education, particularly the way it rewards high prices, is actually getting in the way of us fulfilling that mission. And I'd love to see higher education do what the entertainment industry did and come back and rediscover our mission and see how technology might be able to help us fulfill that. And that's my opening remarks, Danielle. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'd actually like to invite everyone to come back on screens for us to kick off our panel discussion. So I think we should start by just kind of creating a baseline of trying to figure out how we got here. What would you guys say are the top 3 contributors to rising tuition and living costs for students at private and public universities and colleges nationwide? And this is open to anyone who'd like to take this question first.
I can jump in. I think a big one is the system we operate in rewards us for increasing our costs. If you stare closely at the U.S. News and World Report rankings, what you'll discover is one of their big categories is student support. How do we measure student support? We measure it based on how much money universities spend per student on services, right? Economists know a whole lot about diminishing marginal returns. That ranking does not take that into account and encourages universities to spend a whole bunch of money. There have been some studies that say if you want to rise from a ranking of 30 to 40 into the top 25, you need to spend about $120 million extra each year on educating your students. I'm not convinced that's economically efficient.
I mean, a lot of what's going on, it's important to realize, is that college costs are not rising nearly as much as they seem because there's so much financial aid. Right? So if you just go and take a look at the list price of colleges, those have risen to ridiculous levels. But when you find out, well, how many people are even paying these ridiculously high amounts, then you find out, wow, it's not nearly as many as you would think. This is actually an error that is especially prevalent at elite levels because elite people are the ones that pay full price. There's a lot of other people going to school with your kids that are not paying full price. In fact, at top schools, a large majority do not pay full price. And even at state schools, it is very common. The average is much below whatever it is you're seeing. So it's the first thing to keep in mind is that the prices that we're seeing are not really the prices that most people are paying. In terms of what it is that makes schools feel like they keep raising those prices, of course, at the very top schools, the answer is pretty simple, which is they could probably charge 5 times as much and still fill their classrooms. So, Harvard is turning away an enormous number of people. If they were to just raise tuition and then see how much they could get, they could probably go way higher than they're going. So that's something else to keep in mind is the very top schools are actually underpricing relative to how much they could actually get. But still, for the whole system, it is not like that. There are plenty of schools where they are worried about charging too much and that they are going to be losing students from that. I would say that the main reason why the total cost is rising is because there's just so much funding. Most of it most of this funding coming from government, some of it also coming from donors who want to go and donate money to their alma mater, that kind of thing. And then, on top of that, obviously, there's just as society gets richer, the willingness to pay keeps going up, especially for the very premium stuff, the stuff that is not actually expanding in quantity. If you just go and compare the growth of population to the growth of number of students the top schools are admitting, it's just a lot more students than there are. The number of students has grown a lot more than slots of top schools have grown. So that's probably something else that's going on too.
And kind of a follow-up to that, how much of a factor are things like fixed costs at colleges and universities, instructional costs, healthcare benefits, pension costs, all of those sorts of things? Because if you think about what the average residential college or university is, it's almost like a kind of community, an ecosystem in its own right. And there are so many different kind of cost factors that could be at play here. I want to kind of gauge your opinion as to how much is that playing into this ever rising cost that we're seeing. And to be fair, tuition prices haven't actually gone up as much as they were previously, about a generation ago in the last few years. Probably some of this has to do with COVID and other factors like state legislatures telling them to freeze tuition and the like. But I really am curious about how those fixed costs kind of factor into what we're seeing here.
I say the general problem, these are all nonprofits. Nonprofits are notoriously apathetic about saving money and notoriously responsive to aggressive people that are making demands for spending more stuff. When you call them fixed costs, it sort of makes it sound like they're just fixed. There's nothing we can do about them. Well, whatever are we to do? We have to have our, what is it called? The swimming pool that goes around in a circle, the lazy river. We have to have our lazy river. We've already installed it. What are we to do? The truth is that if you have a mentality of not trying to save money, then costs can easily explode into the stratosphere. So I think a lot of what's going on is just that, a lack of discipline. Whenever I look around my university, I see so many easy ways to save money. And yet there is no place where I'm able to go and offer this advice. And if I were, I'm confident it would be ignored because it's not like a regular business where if someone in charge saves money, they get to pocket some of the savings. Instead, it's really the opposite. It's one where the person in charge saves money. They just get some people angry at them. It's so much easier just to go with the flow and go along to get along.
Well, and I'll say just one of the interesting things as I've been researching this book I'm writing, I came across this wonderful quote from Britt Kerwin, who was the president and then chancellor of the University of Maryland system, where he says, if you could deliver the same quality of education at a lower cost, you can be sure of one thing: you're going to go down in the rankings. And that was exactly the experience of Georgia State University. Georgia State University undertook a very aggressive program to try to admit more low-income students by de-emphasizing the SAT, de-emphasizing legacy status. They did all these wonderful things. They ended up in a world where they had more Pell Grant students enrolled than the entire Ivy League combined. So they did all the right things from the perspective of society. What's the problem? By doing those right things, they fell 33 points in the US News and World Report rankings. All of our incentives are telling us to spend more and admit the wealthy students who can pay our bottom line. And I think it's doing bad things for society. I'd really love to hear from Ara, though, because ASU is doing some really innovative things when it comes to delivering education in new ways that lower prices.
Yeah, and kind of rounding out both points, and just to let everybody know, I'm kind of in the between of Mike and Bryan on all of these things, right? So I think my role here is to play mediator a lot of times. But I think that in terms of, when a student goes to a university, and, Danielle called it fixed costs, and Bryan's absolutely right, it makes it sound like it's fixed, but it can be changed. Now, the issue is a lot of times, and my husband says this too, because my husband does not have, he barely graduated high school. He does not have a college degree. And so, but anyways, he'll go, well, it's almost like the university is becoming an exercise of, what is the experience we can sell to the most wealthiest of all the people so that we give them the certificates that they can go about in the world. And that's the criticism he often makes. And, and that is right. So we have a big disparity between the students who are simply, coming to college from low-income families because they know getting that degree certificate is going to be a life-changing experience for themselves and the family, right? So you have that group that we're serving. But we also have very elite students coming from, not elite students in terms of, knowledge and I think all students can do it, but I'm talking about high students from, high-income families coming in, and what they're buying is actually an experience. So, going through a beautiful stadium that's built brand new where, we do sports events, or this boutique little programs or events that it really caters to students that have the time to even attend, right? So that is something that universities need to think about when we think about student success. What are we spending our money on in terms of experiences that we provide to the student, and making sure that we're not just serving students that have the time because they have the affordances to do it, and then, going on that trajectory and serving that population. Now, in terms of what Mike was talking about, what has ASU done? It is one thing that we have done that has been really good, and I think that it makes me feel good about it, is that we have partnered with, corporate institutions, and I'm just giving you some examples, like Starbucks, Uber, or LabCorp. These are private sector people, right? They're companies. And basically, we have made agreements with these folks to offer degree programs to their employees so that, the coverage of tuition is paid for by these companies, where students who are already employed by these companies can get a degree program through us, through ASU, and they are already incorporated into the system. And by getting this degree, that's required for them to move to the next step. So, an example would be a lab tech who already has the skills that they know how to do the job, but they need some sort of certification to move into that management role. For the student, they're working, they need that degree to move up to the next step. The employer pays for that. And then they are going up into the system of the pipeline. And so that is one way that we have creatively thought about how to, help students get the education that they need, and also reward them so that they can work and also get the education. So.
Well,
So-
and Could I just pick up on what Ara is saying about wealth inequalities? Just to put some specific numbers on this, Raj Chetty's research at Harvard says that if you're a child born into a family in the top 1% of income in the United States, you've got a 1 in 4 chance of going to a top 80 most selective school in the United States. So 1 in 4 chance if you're born into the top 1%. If you're born into the bottom 20%, you've got a 1 in 300 chance of going to the same school. And what I say, and please hear this is provocative and not declarative, what I say is if we in higher education genuinely believe that rich kids are 77 times more likely to be deserving of elite education than poor kids, then we're doing great, right? I'm an economist. I believe in the efficient allocation of scarce resources. If it really is the case that rich kids are 77 times more likely to deserve an elite education, then let's pat ourselves on the back. But if we don't believe that, and I don't know anyone who does, then this is a terrible way of allocating that scarce resource. And we're leaving a lot of kids behind solely because they grew up in the wrong zip code.
Any response to that before I go on? Go ahead, Bryan.
I find myself agreeing with a lot of what Michael is saying. The idea that we could improve the system, we could totally improve the system. I can pretty much look outside my window and see ways for it to be a lot better. There's a lot of ways to save money. The main area where I think we disagree is that I think there's a fundamental difference between an industry like higher education that is very heavily supported by taxpayers and any of the other industries that he's talking about. If you're talking about Kodak or Atari or whatever, these are ones where they actually have to get customers to keep buying their products to stay in business. On the other hand, with higher education, we do have customers, we get some money from them, but we get so much money from the government. And furthermore, especially for the public colleges, there is an implicit guarantee. If George Mason University were on the verge of bankruptcy, I'm very confident the state of Virginia would just bail us out. It is just not the same thing. There is a reason why nonprofits like higher education, heavily supported by government, can afford to be oblivious to technological change. There's a reason why we can be so backward looking, which is that we have this incredible safety net provided by government. Also, obviously, when you have things like student loan programs, so this makes it easier for people to go and borrow the money and then pay the tuition and worry about where it's going to come from later on. We have all of this support that these other industries don't have. And I think this is why we can just afford to be so backwards and incompetent and indifferent to progress and all this other bad stuff. So, when I listen to Michael, I feel the enthusiasm and it brings me back. You're like, yeah, like we could totally make this so much better. We could save all this money. Like, oh no, but it's not really going to happen because the incentives are just so terrible. I just picture if I were to read everything Michael's saying, get a list of 100 ways to go and offer better education at George Mason for less cost, schedule a meeting with the university president, and then just think it's going to be, okay, well, we'll take that all under advisement. So we appreciate all of that, because it's like, well, what is going to happen to any university president who aggressively tries to deliver better education for a lower cost? Best case scenario is they get a little bit of it done, they make a lot of enemies, and their lives are really hard. On the other hand, if they just keep doing whatever they're doing, they can enjoy the high life, earn your $1 million salary as a university president. You don't make enemies. You go and tell everybody they're all great. Everyone says you're great. Do that for 10 years and you got a nice life. So I'm just not optimistic about the system's capacity to reform itself. On the other hand, I don't think we're going to go and drive straight into a brick wall either, because the brick wall is not there because we don't really face the market test.
Well, actually, I was wondering about that because the market disruption of lower enrollments, right? So I think a lot of our conversation has been talking about super selective schools. They are the minority. The majority are not. And the reality for many of these schools, particularly community colleges, regional publics, and even to some degree, slightly more selective schools, if you're thinking about that scale, they're starting to face enrollment declines. And given what we all know about demographic trends for the next few years, there are simply not enough high school age graduates to fill those seats. So I do wonder what your thoughts are about how market forces on that front will inform and potentially kind of fuel the sorts of innovations that I think, in fact, Michael has been talking about, or even Ara has been talking about. And also, I think this is also really important. thinking about ASU, Georgia State, places that have been held up as models for what a more cost-effective student-centric model could look like, why has that not been scaled? So those two things, enrollment, scalability of innovation.
I'd argue a decent amount of this goes back to actually the employment market, right? That, Danielle, you're 100% right. The elite universities are in the minority almost by definition. The problem is, and this forces me to agree with Bryan, but the problem is that the elite brand still gets you a whole lot more traction in the job market than if you graduated from a second-tier school. I would love to come up with a system where employers can start to rely less on the brand and more on the actual skills of the students. The other thing I wanted to say to Bryan's point is I'm a little bit worried about a world where only the rich kids can afford things, where we don't have government support coming in to at least support students who grew up in the wrong zip code. What I find interesting is President Obama's statement in his 2012 State of the Union address, where, and this is a quote, President Obama said, "It's not enough for the federal government to increase student aid. We can't keep subsidizing skyrocketing tuition. We'll run out of money. So let me put colleges and universities on notice. If you can't stop tuition from going up, the funding you get from taxpayers will go down." For those of us universities who are dependent on government largesse, that should be a very frightening statement. It hasn't happened yet because we don't have an alternative as a society. But if places like ASU could create a lower priced alternative that scales, I think President Obama could follow through on what he's saying.
Well, I think that also too, a lot of the criticism that ASU gets, and just going back to a couple of different points, because the discussion is really fun, but Arizona as a state, and I'm talking about the state itself, not the university, we actually had a different problem than Bryan's describing, because we were the top, I think, cut to higher ed than any other 49 states. So we had to figure out a way in order for us to scale, to support the students that were here. And so that's why I think it really drove us to think in a different way, because the state funding, I think we had seen the largest cuts than any other state across the United States. And so, but also too, it's, when we decided, and President Crow has decided on this mission to provide access in terms of education to a broader population of folks, he was met with serious criticism. And that is something that I think universities, it has to culturally change, is because often we don't want to admit it because it's just not diversity and inclusive and at all to say, well, we want to be very highly selective. And, we want to talk about diversity and inclusion, but what we're really wanting is this student that maybe, and it's funny because I go around and what they want is a student of color that has a 4.0 GPA, that has an ultra high standardized test score and has all this myriad of experiences too. And they come with all these accolades. And so then that fits the bill. I want that. And I'm thinking, well, those students from like migrant families, from low income families, obviously wouldn't have those experiences. So we can't have both. Okay. And so how do we need to address this problem at the admissions level if we're truly thinking about access? And maybe Bryan will feel better, if we're doing those kinds of procedural changes where we go, if we want this, then we must change in this way administratively, so on and so forth. But that doesn't also address some of the other things that I hope that we also talk about, which is how do we make our degree programs, which haven't been really altered across our institutions for decades of time, so that it does become more relevant. And so that somebody that, like someone like Bryan will go, I feel very good about getting this because it actually set me off to a path to success. So there are multiple things that universities need to be doing. And that is, admitting where we have a broader reach and actually, not being hypocrites to what we claim to do in terms of, educating and doing good for society? And also, once the students are in, how do we make sure that we're modernizing what we actually teach to people so that people aren't coming out and students are wondering, what's the point of listening to these people Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and what did I just spend my money on? And that is not a feeling we want to give to students, nor is that what employers want. So there are multiple things that we need to be addressing here.
So we have quite a lot of audience questions. I'm going to start taking some, and I'd also encourage the audience to continue to submit questions for our esteemed panel here. One audience question actually is directed to you, Bryan. What impact would your reduction of access plan, this is how the question is being framed, have on income inequality over the next 10 to 15 years? I think that's a real concern among several of the audience questions that we've received so far.
That's a great question. Here's the thing. Whenever people think about listening to doing what I'm doing, they picture what would happen if we did it to just one student. What if one student gets rejected from college? And there I will say the normal view is correct. That's bad for that one student. It cuts them off from a lot of opportunities, everything else. But the right question to ask is, what if the system listened to me? What if the system listened to me? What this means is a lot fewer people go to college, which means that employers must become more open-minded about who is worthy of an interview. That is the whole idea of credential inflation. In the world of 1945, only about 25% of Americans had finished high school. In that world, if an employer says, I'd only consider college graduates for the job, they'll just have no one available for it, and they will go out of business. You must be more open-minded when the number of people with the credentials that you previously thought were required are no longer there. Now, if people were actually learning useful skills in school, what I'm talking about would be very dangerous, because this would mean say, well, we're going to go and make someone brain surgeons who don't know what they're doing. Fortunately, that is not the way that school actually works. Most of what you're learning is not relevant in the real world. It's basically just a place where they delay you from starting your real job for 5 years. And then finally you show up and it's like, oh, wow, I finished college, but I don't know how to do anything. What now? Well, glad you asked. We're now here to train you by doing, which is the way normal humans actually learn how to do anything. Normal people don't learn very well from lectures. They learn by doing. So I say the effect on inequality, I think, would be basically nothing. I mean, here's one other way of thinking about it. So my best friend at Princeton came from an extremely poor family, and it was great for him. All right, because he was a great student, and he was then able to break out of the situation, right? And everything worked out great for him. However, what about the siblings of that great student who are not great students, right? What if they wind up being high school dropouts? In 1945, opportunities for high school dropouts were much better, precisely because the degree was so many, 75% of workers were in the same boat. Now the stigma against a high school dropout is so much higher. So the main thing to think about whenever you're implementing reform is not just how it affects the people that are affected first. Think about how it changes the entire hiring system. And I say there's really only one answer. The hiring system would have to become much more open-minded about who is worthy of getting an interview. And so, yeah, I think the effect on inequality is at least very unclear that it would be any increase at all.
So I think it's fascinating. We are starting to see states, I think Maryland was one of the first places that said that they would welcome, stop using college degrees as a determining factor for employment. But one of our audience members raised an interesting question, and the question's for the panelists, but also for you, Bryan. Your description, Bryan, of the purpose of education is very different than Aristotle's idea of education, that the ends of education is to uncover one's highest purpose and become a more engaged citizen. To what extent should education focus on skills versus these other important goals? And it's open to all of you.
Yeah, so I do have a chapter in my book on this kind of stuff. There's a lot of people wrote a review and said, Bryan is just a Neanderthal economist. He's totally tone deaf to the wonder of ideas and culture. Ideas and culture are my life. This is the stuff that I really enjoy. But what I do say in that chapter is we shouldn't give colleges credit for good intentions. We should see what they actually accomplish. Is it really true that colleges successfully inspire love of Shakespeare? It is just not true. And we can go down the list. While there's a lot of talk about bringing people up to the very best person they can be, in practice, I just see almost no sign of that happening. 1 in 100, 1 in 200 people, you might say something like that's going on. Almost everyone, even when asked, will admit the main reason they are in college is to get a better job and make more money. So that's what I focus on, because I think that is really what colleges in fact are offering. If colleges were to say, look, there's actually zero evidence that coming here will give you a better job or raise your salary, but we will go and make you a better person. If that became widely believed, I think they would basically finally go out of business, because there's just almost no demand for that. And honestly, if you want to become a better person, there are so many ways of doing it that are so cheap. You can, if you want to expand your mind, you can now watch the best lecturers in the universe on YouTube all day, every day. You can talk to other people who like this stuff all day, every day. The sad reality is there's just not much demand for that. What really sustains the system of education we have is this promise of getting a better job and more money.
I'll provide a counterexample by anecdote and personal anecdote. As a undergraduate electrical engineer at the University of Maryland, I was forced to take gen ed classes. And as an 18-year-old stupid guy, what I said is, I'll take a women's studies class. How hard could it be? And what I discovered is that not only was it hard, but it was also incredibly important, and opened my eyes to a bunch of things that I wouldn't have otherwise seen if the University of Maryland hadn't forced me to take that class. So I still think there's some things that we in higher education can do in terms of broadening people's minds. I totally agree with Bryan, though, that we're not doing a good job of it. And to do a good job of it, I think we're going to need to think more creatively about how to deliver that education using technology. And like I say, I think ASU is doing some amazing things in that context. Ara is doing some amazing things about how do you deliver organic chemistry in a remote delivery model that I find really inspiring.
Wouldn't we just have to change human nature, Michael? So like Steven Pinker, gets all these awards for best professor at Harvard, and he says he's got only 50% of students even attending his class. We have the hand-picked students, the best and the brightest, and they have an opportunity to study with one of the greatest teachers at Harvard, and half of them say, no thanks, I don't feel like it. I would just say, like, most people are Philistines, always have been, always will be. It's really hard as a person who is not a Philistine to accept that other people are this way. I've accepted it.
I don't disagree with you that we're not doing a good job. I just
could we? Is there anyone so great? Could Robin Williams himself get most people to like poetry? I don't think so.
So I'd like Ara to come in as the kind of buffer to a nihilistic conversation. I feel like some of the work that you're doing in something like organic chemistry and your ability to kind of have this hybrid model that you have, can you share a little bit about that and what kind of results you've seen? And not to say that this could happen everywhere, but I do think it's a fascinating example of how engagement can change, can innovate.
Yes, thank you very much. And by the way, you guys, my job here at ASU, I play mediator all day, every day. So I just, so I'm very used to it. But let me tell you something. So couple things. So I think let's talk about what I do first. So in terms of ASU, we haven't, I hate to use this word, sold off our online division to some other extra entity outside of ASU. So when I say we have online students, I used to teach on campus, I now teach online, I am the same faculty that have done both of those things. And we have an online degree program that we offer through our own department, and that's across ASU. So it's not a separate entity altogether. But, when we offer the online programs, it turned out that, in STEM, although we are in the state of Arizona and we're a state school, so we serve a large group of diverse set of students, we found out in the conventional on-campus degree programs, the students who elect to take STEM degrees as their majors, it is not that diverse. It does not represent the greater student body of our institution. But when we went online, it opened the door, and the demographics of the students completely changed. And, and what it actually addressed was a different problem that Danielle mentioned a while ago, and I don't know if you all caught that, was we cannot rely on high school graduates alone to fulfill the amount of workforce that we need in the United States as an economy to proceed. So what has happened in the United States was students came, and life came, right? And it was difficult, especially for the students who are middle class to low income from those families to continue their education, and they left, or maybe they weren't that interested in whatever they elect to choose as a major, which is fine. They're 18 years old. How are you going to know what you're going to do? And so they left, and a lot of the online students are the folks that are adults, average age of 26, about 30 years old, that came back to finish off their degree, right? And in terms of demographics, we saw a higher increase of women. We saw a higher increase of, 3% of Black African-American students in the conventional degree program on campus to 11%. So we increased the number and the diversity of the student body that we are offering STEM degrees to. And it turned out these people are adults, they're professionals. So they have jobs already. You can't be, expecting students to come for 3 hours in the middle of the day to do labs on campus. They have families and an 8-to-5 job, right? So I teach a particular course where students come and do the experiments that could be done across 15 weeks, 3 hours a week. Instead, we have the students come in for 3.5 days, and they are in this very immersive environment where they spend the entire 3.5 days with me doing every single experiment in a row, where they're so immersed in this lab environment where we see significant changes in how they identify themselves as scientists, which we don't see with the on-campus, and rightfully so. Students are busy. Faculty always think my class is the best. Well, they're going to psych, they're going to math, they're going to economics classes. They don't have time for you. They don't have time to think about, 4 things at once. And that's a cognitive load. That, right? So in this particular model, we've seen great increases as to how the students feel about themselves, how much they've actually gained in terms of knowledge, and so on and so forth. And because it's a 3.5 days, students who are working professionals can come, and they're not, sacrificing their weekly job in order for them to attend here. So that's just one delivery model. We engage in different spaces as well. Going online and working on these different modalities has really shifted our thinking into what are we teaching, and what do students really actually absolutely need to know. And that has allowed us to engage in space where it's not just virtual in terms of online delivery where you just meet a professor over Zoom, but how does it look like in a virtual reality environment, for instance, or so on and so forth. So that's some of the innovative work that we've done as an institution.
And I mean, if I could just pick up on that, I think what Ara's talking about is, let's follow our mission of delivering education and start to question whether our model of 80-minute lectures twice a week for 14 weeks helps us fulfill that. The example I think of as she's talking is an example I heard from someone at, let's just say, a top business school, where they had an executive education program, 7 weeks in person, and you had to move to their campus to have the on-campus cohort effect. And the only problem that they found with this program is female executives weren't signing up in anywhere near the numbers they knew they existed in the marketplace. During COVID, they took that on-campus program and took it online. And guess what? Female executives showed up in the proportions that you'd expect. And it's obvious ex post that there are a lot of things that my daughter would call the patriarchy that keep female executives from being able to move for 7 weeks to a particular city. But that if we relax the way we think about delivery, we can actually include people who we otherwise were excluding. I would love to see higher education do the hard steps of thinking about what actually has to be done on campus and what can we do perfectly well remotely. And just one other example, I think about this, I talked to the head of data at UPMC, and what he says is in healthcare, they've looked at their data, and what they've discovered is that for most types of doctor-patient interactions, telehealth works just fine. There are a lot of things you need to come to the hospital for, but telehealth works just fine for these things. I would love to see us as higher educators say, what are the things that we can deliver perfectly well remotely? And to Ara's point, what are the things that we might actually be able to do a better job of delivering in person if we questioned our model?
Yeah, real quick, I mean, just imagine that all of this comes to pass and we manage to go and double the share of Americans with college degrees. What is this going to mean in the job market? It's going to mean that a college degree is no longer going to be good enough to get you the job that it currently gets. You're going to have to get another degree. That is the treadmill that we're on. I keep talking about this, but I really just don't see any way around it.
So I feel like there is some agreement among us all that, practical skills training is important for the economy, important for the workforce. And I do wonder, and then just bringing in an audience question here, what do you think the role of trade schools will be in the future in relation to higher education? And perhaps are we seeing models within higher education, or at least what people think of higher education, like community colleges, for example, of that kind of trade skills training that could be scaled and could be perhaps something that more regional schools, even the more selective schools, really try to build upon, so that we're able to ensure that we're getting workforce training while giving people the opportunity to also expand their minds?
Go ahead, Bryan.
I think trade schools would be a huge improvement over most of what we do. I think it'd be great to start them at a much younger age. Systems like they have in Germany and Switzerland are much more functional than what we have. I am not at all optimistic this is going to happen because it goes so much against the whole mentality of everyone needs to go to college, as well as this incredible aversion to any kind of inequality or any possibility that you're not being sufficiently inclusive or diverse. I mean, it's really, the problem is it's a system that works, it's functional, but it doesn't sound very good to people, and that's the problem, unfortunately.
Yeah, and Bryan, my husband is what people call so-called blue collar worker. And obviously he went to trade school. And so thank you so much for that audience that gave the props up for trade schools. But my husband, think about it. He's a mechanic. He owns his own small business. He obviously has his trade. And he actually wants to come back to getting a college degree. And I think it's going to be a really powerful thing. And that's because my husband has a on the ground knowledge of things that are wrong with cars. And so I want him to actually go and get an engineering degree. He wants to go be an anthropologist. He says he wants to study how systems work. And so but I'm like, Patrick, that would be such a powerful thing, because I think you can teach a thing or two about what you know in terms of hands-on experience that you get from day-to-day activities, and actually come back. And I hope that some faculty member here at ASU will go, wow, Patrick, that's an incredible thing that how do I apply, what we can teach you and shift into more of a project-based thing where we can align what from your trade into how we teach, in the higher education system, and come up with a different type of model that is inclusive of people's assets that they bring to the table. So I think of the skills that people gain from trades as not an irrelevant thing, because we do need skilled trades people, and thinking of that as an asset that they can bring to the table so that they can shift our thinking in terms of how it is, traditionally has been done in higher ed, is how I can see those two areas merge, because, I think that those folks will have a lot of relevant things to say that actually matter. Whereas often what I see in terms of curriculum that we teach is extremely knowledge-based. And, some of my colleagues will say, well, I know that this is been disproven and it doesn't work, but we just teach it because that's just what we do. And I'm like, that's the wrong answer. Stop teaching that immediately. You should have a change in curriculum, right? So, going forward is how do we merge those areas and really bring in the assets that each area and the sectors, where that's business, where that's, our own research, and how we can come into a more interdisciplinary thing. But that's a very utopian way to think, right?
Well, I don't know that it's utopian, actually, right? If you think about the benefits of diversity, what I hear you saying is actually not only would your husband benefit from that, but all the other students in the class would benefit from having access to your husband and his experiences. The one that sparks for me is we in higher education historically have a bias towards the sorts of people who don't belong at college. And the one I think of is in the early days of the GI Bill, colleges fought the GI Bill tooth and nail. We had college presidents saying, we don't want these service people on our campus. It will create an educational hobo village if we allow service people access to our campuses. What did we discover? Service people actually are great participants in our campus, and they benefit everybody from their perspective. I'd love to see us in higher education think more broadly about who we want to admit. I just don't think we can within a model that benefits us for being exclusive and elite. That's my biggest fear.
So I'll just close it off with one last question, because I think we really did get into this issue of kind of the debt structure, but probably not as much, because even if we are thinking more liberally about who's being admitted, how they're being educated, all these things still cost. So how do we, I'll leave you with this last question. What would you offer as your best piece of advice for the current higher education model? And that's inclusive of selective universities and colleges, trade schools, because they're all still a part of that, to really disrupt their cost structure to deliver a more affordable education to American families.
The big thing that I push is austerity. I know it's not popular, but we spend way too much money in education, and we should think very seriously about massive cuts, knowing full well this is going to reduce the number of people who go, but I say that's actually a good thing.
I would argue, again, technology, that technology, delivering education digitally scales radically different than delivering education in person. I would love to see us in higher education think about what can we deliver perfectly well digitally at a much lower cost because it scales. And what are the things that have to be done on campus, even though we know that we're going to have to deliver them at a fairly high marginal cost.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that other states have done well, and Danielle brought this up, Tennessee and Michigan, which is more of thinking about a work and learn model. You know, I think that what Bryan is pointing out was with over-educating people unnecessarily. I totally agree with that. I am against over-education for the means of just educating. But I also get Michael's point, which is, you know, if we're going to go and if we want to have Bryan's model, that means we have to change how we do everything. And that's going to be a hard challenge to fight. But given the system that we have, okay, what can we do better? Which is we need to really award and allow folks to have a work and learn model. So if they can't, because of this given context and the situation that we're in and how the entire system is set up, that we still allow students who have employment, who have jobs, to still go to college simultaneously so that they can actually afford what they're doing and also get an education. Because I just don't think that all of a sudden all the companies are going to go, oh, no college degree, you don't need to bring it to the table. No, we're not going to do that collectively. They're just not going to do that, I don't think, unless Bryan can convince everybody through his book, right? And so because we have that, you know, allowing students to be more flexible in terms of delivery and also in terms of the financial aid model at the federal level, currently students have to be at least half-time in order for them to, you know, gain the financial aid, in order for them to, you know, get the loans that they need to pay for the tuition. So how do we change some of the things that we do in terms of financial aid so that it encompasses students that may be even less than full-time or non-degree seeking, so that it is a more flexible way of delivery? working, at the four-year institutions, with the two-year institutions, with the high school level people, with all of them working together in a pipeline sort of way where, we credit students, if that could be dual enrollment, where that minimizes costs and awards students with credit earlier. That may be where we have a particular internship program where the students are allowed to be interns, and then we offer them with credits while they go through school, and the modality is through online. All of these things, we need to really come to a creative solution on providing students with more flexibility than we have been so far.
Thank you all. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope our audience did as well. I just want to thank our panelists for all that they contributed today, and I hope that this leaves us all with something to think about the sustainability and future of higher education in its current form. Thank you.